These are the stories we share around the dinner table, tell in front of the campfire, and listen to on our porch. This is a place where tales are told and stories are heard. Grab your tea, your cocoa, your whiskey, your wine. Welcome to the Storyteller's Porch with your host, Jill Davis.
Welcome to the Storyteller's Porch. Today, my guest is Amy Porter. She is an early childhood educator, mother of two, a congenital heart disease advocate, and quite honestly, a delightful porch companion. Amy and I have been chatting for a bit about her story and what she wants to share, and I'm so glad you're here, Amy.
Thanks for having me.
My listening audience can't see your face, but I can see your smiling face, and I'm glad you're here. And I know, in our tradition, we always bring a drink to the porch. What are we sharing today, Amy?
Well, today my son decided to wake up at 5:30 in the morning, and we are in the midst of a historical heat wave here in the prairies, so I am drinking iced coffee.
Well, I understand the need for lots of coffee. I recently watched my 2.5-year-old grandson for a period of time, and I think I must have used to have drank at least 2 pots of coffee a day. So I'm still recovering, so I will share your coffee with you.
Sounds great.
I don't think that parents get nearly enough credit for how much work it takes to raise these little people. And I was talking to another guest recently, Amy, about how children, when I was being raised, and I was born in 1962, I was raised as an extension of my parents. I was to be seen and not heard. I was to behave in the ways they taught me to behave. And that was it. I wasn't allowed to have personality. And not that there was, anything about that. That's just the way we were raised.
Right.
And my oldest 2 children, I hate to admit, I might have done a little bit of that with them. And then realize that each child is very unique and individual. And they have the right to their own personality and their own feelings. And I think it's even harder to raise kids when you raise them that way. So blessings to you for raising 2 of them.
Thank you.
Tell me about your little people in your world.
Frankie is my very brilliant 4-year-old. She is very much into dinosaurs and can tell you everything about them, more than I actually know most of the time. So if you have any dinosaur questions, you can ask my 4-year-old. And my son Artie is coming up on his first birthday, and it will be a celebration even through COVID. I think it'll be an amazing day filled with loads of emotion.
Absolutely. And I already know this, our audience doesn't yet, that Artie has a very special place and reason for having such a celebration of his 1-year-old birth and his 1-year-old growth year. So tell us a little bit, Amy, your story today is about that delightful little boy named Artie in your life.
Yeah. So as a pregnant woman in her second trimester, the pandemic lockdown in March of 2020 wasn't entirely inconvenient. 2 weeks after everything shut down, my family had the opportunity to go to my 20-week anatomy scan together so that we could see the newest member of our family. And at this appointment, my wife and I learned that our daughter was going to have a little brother, and it took ages. But after a few weeks, we settled on naming our son Arturo, or Artie for short, like you mentioned. From conception onward, Artie has embodied the delicate balance of luck and chaos, and I was measuring large. Somehow, my pregnant belly was measuring 5 weeks ahead, despite knowing exactly when his conception was. So to be cautious, my obstetrician sent me in for a routine 28-week ultrasound to check on my fluid levels. Without knowing that safety protocols had changed due to COVID, my wife and daughter decided to come along, excited for another chance to see the baby, but both of them were turned away at the entrance. "Sorry, only the patient is allowed to go in," said the receptionist. "Oh, all right." So my daughter was disappointed, obviously. So she left the clinic with my wife, but we made a deal, and we told her that she could watch a movie in the car while I had my ultrasound. That seemed to satisfy her, so everyone was on their way. I like to identify as a research nerd. I love learning, and part of this is a coping mechanism for anxiety for sure. But I also just love knowledge. So anytime that I have ever had an ultrasound, I've spent my time trying to decipher exactly what it is that I'm looking at. It's like a puzzle. And for a routine ultrasound that was supposed to be looking at my fluid levels, we weren't looking at my fluid levels. The technician was looking at his heart very deliberately and very silently. LVOT, RVOT, what is that? The technician stopped being chatty and she just kept clicking. Click, measure, click, change the angle, measure, click, click, zoom in, click, zoom in some more, ponder. 25 minutes went on like this. Measure, click. All on his heart, nothing else. She left the room to get the pictures verified and was gone for another 20 minutes. And when she returned, I was allowed to leave. And as I waddled down the 2 flights of stairs, cradling my giant belly, I had tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, that this thorough investigation on his heart meant absolutely nothing. But as I exited the air-conditioned building covered with that gross, slimy hand sanitizer, for the first time in my life, not even the smell of freshly bloomed spring lilacs could distract me from the feeling of impending doom growing from inside my chest. I knew that something was not right. I sat down beside my wife in the car, Frankie happily occupied with her movie. I think that something's wrong with his heart, I told Sam quietly enough so that our daughter wouldn't hear. And bless her heart, she tried to quell my fears, but during our 12 years together, my gut instincts have scarcely been wrong. Well, if something's wrong, they'll call us, she tried to reassure. So to distract ourselves, we decided to head down to a local park to watch the new baby goslings navigate the pond. And for a while, this perfectly sunny day observing the Canadian geese succeeded in distracting me from my thoughts. Until my phone rang. It was my obstetrician calling me in for an emergency appointment the next day. My stomach was instantly in knots. My heart and my mind were racing. What was going on? From then on out, 3 children cycled through my mind. George Kemp, my friend's son. He has had 2 heart transplants before the age of 4. We know now that transplant is not a cure. Donor hearts don't last forever, and so he will need another one at some point in time in his life. And then there's Bennett. Bennett. I say his name repeatedly because although he lived only briefly after birth, his life means something, and his name matters. The impact he has made on me is immeasurable. Little baby Bennett. Then there's Artie, my own son. Is this your fate? What is going on? George, Bennett, Artie. My appointment was scheduled for the early afternoon, but how do you parent a 3-year-old when your mind is in crisis? I couldn't be mentally present for her as the feelings of fear and grief thrashed against me throughout the morning, so I just sat beside her as we watched endless movies. George, Bennett, Artie. George, Bennett, Artie. Due to the pandemic, I was forced to attend this appointment alone, feeling as though I was marching toward a sentencing for a crime that I did not commit, the doctor, my judge. I'm sorry, said the doctor, but it looks as though your baby has a rare heart defect called transposition of the great arteries. Basically, what this means is that his main arteries grew in the wrong positions. They're backwards. I'm really sorry. I refused to let the world crash around me. I needed to know exactly what this meant. So I pushed my feelings aside and I looked at her and I said, "What are his chances?" "I don't know," said the doctor. "Is it fixable?" "I really don't know," she said. "The hospital will be in touch with you to confirm the diagnosis, and then they'll take care of you from there. Do you have any other questions?" Well, I had about 1,000 questions, but it was clear that this doctor didn't specialize in his heart defect. What was it called? I asked her to write down his diagnosis for me, and as I got up to leave the appointment with the words transposition of the great arteries written on a sticky note, the doctor stopped me and said, "Just don't Google it." My eyes began to fill with tears. My chest was brimming with sorrow and panic, but I would not allow myself to fall apart. Not here in the doctor's office, alone and unable to touch my face because of the mask that felt suffocating for the first time during this pandemic. As I reached my car, I slathered my hands in sanitizer, got inside, and wept. How do I tell my wife? How do I tell our 3-year-old that our baby has a broken heart? I called my wife, and we agreed not to tell our daughter anything until we knew better what we were up against. This day sits amongst one of the most heart-wrenching moments that I've ever had to endure. With a week in between this meeting and getting his formal diagnosis, I plunged myself into research as a way to cope with the overwhelming fear that I had. And what I found was this. First, his condition is repairable with open heart surgery sometime in the first 10 days of his life. And 2, this surgery has a 96% success rate. I immediately felt more at ease, knowing at least that there was a solution. The next 2 months were an absolute whirlwind as teams of doctors met with us virtually to walk us through the organized chaos of keeping him alive until his life-saving arterial switch. And it was at this moment when I realized the kismet of naming our son Artie prior to knowing about his backwards arteries. It seems as though he really took his name to heart. We had many conversations with our daughter about Artie's broken heart, and her brilliant 3-year-old brain understood completely that the doctors would have to physically break him apart in order to fix the heart inside of him. And as I was overcome with emotion at the capacity of her understanding, she cradled my face in her hands and told me, "Don't cry, Mama. Sometimes things have to hurt before they can get better. And the doctors know how to put them back together." She gave me a kiss on my nose and rubbed my belly. Hearing my own words reflected back to me was surprisingly reassuring. And had it not been for that pivotal moment during my ultrasound when his defect was found, my son would have died within hours after birth. Knowing that his heart was broken, doctors knew what to expect. And so when his oxygen saturation plummeted 3 hours after birth, they knew to perform an emergency procedure, ripping a hole inside of his heart to allow oxygen to reach his extremities. On his 7th day of life, we were told to say our goodnights as we watched the surgeons roll his sedated body away to operate on his tiny, walnut-sized heart. 6 hours passed, and we were finally able to see him completely covered in wires and drainage tubes. His nurse walked us through each one's function, then moved over to his medications and what each beep and bloop on his monitoring screen meant. I kept waiting for her to finish, but the list of items felt endless. My stomach was rolling. I had to sit down. I felt so sick to my stomach. My wife continued to listen to the nurse, and as I sat, completely overwhelmed by it all, I took a breath and I looked at my son. And I mean, I really looked at him. And that's when I noticed that his skin was pink, like noticeably pink. I didn't realize how blue he was before until that moment. And I could see already that he was healthier and that we just had to make it through recovery. 8 days later, we were discharged. And the only prescription he had was for infant Tylenol and vitamin D. After 14 days apart, we were able to be reunited with our daughter, who had stayed with her aunt and cousins, and our kids have been inseparable ever since. I mean, partly it's due to the pandemic and they can't physically leave each other, but the other part is that they simply love each other completely. Our daughter has an overwhelming sense of responsibility to keep him safe. And while this is seemingly the perfect place to end my story, it's not. And here's why. When I had the hospital appointment to confirm his diagnosis, I felt optimistic. At that point, I knew what procedures he would need and what his treatment would look like. But what I didn't expect was the doctor telling me that because our son had a fatal heart condition, that we would have the option of terminating the pregnancy. And I knew that wasn't going to be my choice, but I also understand why people go that route for many different reasons, quality of life for one of them. But living in Canada, I never once had to think or worry about the cost of my son's treatment. Each ultrasound, fetal echo, our entire NICU stay, his heart surgery, all of this cost me absolutely nothing. And it breaks my heart that our neighboring country, although touting to be pro-life, forces families into financial distress or bankruptcy for just trying to keep their child alive. The hospital cost for children with CHD in the US is over $1.5 billion annually, which proves to me that human life is considered a privilege for those who can afford it and not a God-given right. On top of this, children will have an incredibly difficult time finding insurance that will cover their pre-existing condition as they reach adulthood. And the fact that they're even reaching adulthood is amazing, considering that these life-saving medical interventions only became successful about 35 years ago. But if you think that broken hearts are rare, you would be wrong. Congenital heart defects are the most common type of birth defect and leading cause of infant mortality worldwide, affecting 1 in 100 infants. And 25% of those will require surgical intervention just to survive. Despite the prevalence of this disease, prenatal diagnosis is missed 50 to 70% of the time, and it receives less research funding than childhood cancer, which is terrible and awful and absolutely deserves funding, but it affects fewer families than congenital heart disease. This experience has completely changed me, and having to go through the bulk of it completely alone due to the global pandemic has left me reaching out to others who share a similar story. And let me tell you, there are millions of us out there. We are your friends, your neighbors, we are nobody, and we are everybody. We've watched our children fight for their lives, and some of us have held our children as their lives have faded away. People often describe us, our families and children, as strong and brave, but the truth is we have no other choice. We must be brave because we know that although a broken heart cannot be cured, it can be mended. That this process will leave scars behind, and that with time, these marks will fade, but they will never be erased. We've learned that sometimes things have to hurt before they can get better. And although these scars will not define our lives, they will forever be a part of our stories.
Amy, thank you so much. Your story is so powerful for so many reasons to me. One of the things I try not to do on our porch is to make meaning out of everything, but quite honestly, I just can't help myself. Everything has meaning. And as I listen to you, I love that line. Sometimes things just have to hurt before they get better. And as I listened to you, I had so many thoughts, and I want to just share a few of them with you and with our listeners. First of all, tell me again what it was that the defect that Artie had.
His specific defect is called transposition of the great arteries. So his pulmonary and aorta are switched.
And to me, that sounds like the title of a fabulous book, but yet it's something that has so much pain and so much fear. I would have been petrified if I had had any of that happen in any of my ultrasounds. And I had many, many of them with 4 kids. So there's so many defining points that go through childhood and life. And you've already hit one of the most defining when you sent him off to surgery.
It was a big day.
A very big day. I cannot imagine. And I think of, when I sent one of my sons off to reserve officer training school, and I just the thought of that. And I thought I might not have ever, he may end up in war and I may never see him again or whatever could happen, but nothing like sending an infant off to the surgeon. I just can't even imagine. So I know you have begun this incredible adventure in life. And I do need to point something out as a mother of 4 grown children. I know that Frankie knows more about dinosaurs than you do. And I just want to give you a heads up. It's not going to be the last thing she knows a lot more about than you do.
I have absolutely no doubt about that.
They continue to do that. And it's to the point now I call my children instead of them calling me. Although on occasion they still call me. And as I listened to your story, I thought about 2 things. One specifically was over the last years, I'm 58. I'm cis hetero. I was raised in a family that had income. I was raised with an education. And I've dealt with all of those pieces of privilege, and I'm aware of them, and they will show up in so many different ways. But I never thought having a child was part of my privilege. And none of my 4 children, although all of them were high risk children, all of them were C-sections, none of them bankrupt us because we had military health care, which is very similar to socialized medicine. And that was a big deal. As I heard that, I thought, I never thought, and my daughter, who is queer, will have to pay a lot of money to even become pregnant.
Yeah, it's a big deal. And I mean, even within the congenital heart defect world, our son is still lucky because a lot of children require multiple surgeries in order to survive. They're living with only half of a functioning heart and a completely rearranged blood circulatory system. And they're able to survive and have fulfilling lives, but it requires at least 3 surgeries to get that done. And so the price tag on top of that is insurmountable to some.
It would not be possible for many, many people. And I know in our country, I don't have the resources, but if you Google it, you'll find all the resources of people who do help financially with that. We do have those organizations. And I hope at some point having children is not part of the privilege that we have. The other thing that I really saw as you were talking and you spoke about watching Artie's skin turn pink, that it was pink now. I think that is the hope of this year. And I'm going to tear up because I teared up as I listened to you. The hope of the year of 2020, where we as a world in a global pandemic did not know we were going to survive. I believe that in a sense, our skin is starting to turn pink. We did not feel like we were going to make it, and we have. And I see that hope in your story of Artie. And I intend to come back and check in on you many times to see how that little guy is doing. I'm super excited to hear more about him and to learn more about you and your family. Amy, as we wind down our time here on our porch, our stories that we share here on the porch are personal, but they do have collective impact. I've shared my takeaway, which is something I don't normally do, but I'd love to hear what kind of collective impact you might hope to have with your story.
Honestly, I would just love for the barriers that prevent us all from living life with optimal health to be eliminated. And I sincerely hope that scientific medical research will advance quickly enough so that nobody has to live with a broken heart.
That's beautiful. I love that. And I also love the way you phrase it as a broken heart, because we know that our emotional heart gets broken and heals. And I'm so glad that Artie's is healing. And I know his 1-year anniversary is actually when we will be releasing this episode. So tell me what date that is and why that's important, Amy.
August 6th was the day that he was taken in for surgery. And it was the day that we could actually see him begin to live rather than slowly watching him fail.
That pink skin beginning to breathe. We will be releasing this. So if you're hearing this, it is past August 6th, 2021, and we have celebrated Artie's Heart Day. Thank you for being with us here today, Amy.
Thank you so much for having me.
And here at the Storyteller's Porch, we believe we are the stories we share. Keep living your story and meet us next time here on this porch, and be sure to bring your favorite drink.
To learn more about our storytellers and our host, Jill Davis, you can find their bios and their social media links at thestorytellersporch.com. To make sure you hear every story with us on the porch, follow us on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Google Podcast, Stitcher, and wherever you hear your favorite shows. We'll see you next time here on the porch, where I'll be drinking some iced coffee and cream. What drink will you bring?